The smell reached the street before anything else did. Not the smell of the river, though the Thames was close enough that its breath settled into the stones every morning before the city woke. This was different. Denser. Something that did not move with the wind the way most smells do, but held its position, as if it had soaked into the mortar and the timber so completely that the building and the smell had become a single thing, inseparable, mutual, permanent. Field Lane, Holborn, 1847. The lane was not wide enough for two carts to pass each other without negotiation. The buildings on either side leaned toward one another at the upper floors, not dramatically, not enough to alarm a casual observer, but enough that the strip of sky visible from the street below had been narrowing, almost imperceptibly, for the better part of 30 years. By 1847 it had become less a street than a corridor. A corridor that happened to have people living inside its walls. Those who lived there had stopped noticing the smell long ago. That was always the first thing visitors noted, not the overcrowding, not the broken windows sealed with strips of cloth and old newspaper pressed flat against the glass, not the children sitting on the front steps in January without shoes, their feet the color of the stone beneath them. The first thing was always the smell. And the second thing, almost without exception, was the silence of the people who moved through it. A silence that did not suggest peace, or rest, or even indifference. A silence that suggested exhaustion so total, so long-standing, that it had become indistinguishable from the air itself. A cart was making its way down the lane that morning. Two men walking beside it, one at the front, one at the rear, neither speaking, neither looking at the other. The horse was old and moved without being directed, as if it had made this particular journey enough times to no longer require instruction. The cart carried something covered in canvas. The shape beneath it was irregular, not the clean rectangle of furniture, not the neat bundle of goods for market. Irregular, and shifting slightly with each turn of the wheels over the uneven stone, in the particular way that only certain kinds of weight shift when they are no longer capable of shifting themselves. A woman was standing in the doorway of number 26. She watched the cart pass the way a person watches weather, without surprise, without particular feeling, with a specific quality of attention that comes from having watched similar things pass many times before and having learned, through repetition, that watching changes nothing. She did not follow the cart with her eyes for long. She looked back at the lane itself, at the stone, at the walls, at the narrow column of grey morning light pressing down between the buildings. Then she turned and went inside. The door closed behind her. The cart continued to the end of the lane and turned. The sound of the wheels faded. The horse did not make a sound. There were questions on Field Lane that had gone unasked for so long they had ceased to feel like questions at all. What the cart carried was one of them. Where it was going was another. They had become part of the texture of the place, as unremarkable, as constant, as the creak of the staircase inside number 26 at the third step from the bottom, the one that groaned under any weight above 40 pounds, the one that everyone who lived there had learned to step over without thinking, the way you learn to step over something that has always been there and shows no sign of ever being repaired. The building held 12 families in 1847. That was the number recorded in the parish survey conducted that spring. 12 families across 4 floors and an attic space that the survey noted, in its careful administrative language, as being of uncertain occupancy. Uncertain. The word sat in the margin of the report like a stone dropped into water, and then the report moved on, to the next address, to the next set of numbers, and the uncertainty was left exactly where it had been found. Inside the building, somewhere above the ground floor, something shifted. A sound, not a voice, not a footstep, not anything that resolved itself into an identifiable source. Something between a groan and a settling, the kind of sound old buildings make when the weight they carry redistributes itself in ways that were never part of any plan. Or the kind of sound that something else makes entirely, when the walls are thick enough and the street outside is quiet enough and no one is listening closely enough to distinguish between the two. The woman did not come back to the doorway. The lane was empty now. The smell remained exactly where it had always been. The corridor had no window. That was not unusual for buildings on Field Lane. Light was not something the architecture had been designed around. The building had been designed around rent. Around the maximum number of bodies that could occupy a given volume of space without the structure itself registering a formal complaint. Light was incidental. Light was what came in through the front door when someone opened it, and what disappeared again when they closed it behind them. During the day, the corridor existed in a condition that was not quite darkness and not quite anything else. A grey suspension, the kind of light that does not illuminate so much as suggest the presence of objects. The staircase at the far end. The wall on the left, its plaster bubbled and soft in places, marked at shoulder height by the accumulated passage of hands that had steadied themselves against it for years. The floor, stone at the entrance, then wood that had been stone once, in the sense that it had become almost as hard and as cold and as indifferent as stone. And the door. The door at the end of the corridor, to the right of the staircase, was not on any plan of the building that survived. This was not remarkable in itself. The plans that existed for properties on Field Lane were incomplete at best, and at worst were documents that bore only a passing relationship to the buildings they were supposed to describe. Rooms had been subdivided. Walls had been added and removed without record. Spaces that had begun as one thing had become, through necessity and time and the particular creativity that extreme poverty produces, something else entirely. So the door's absence from the plans meant nothing, or could have meant nothing. What was noted, by at least two of the families who lived in number 26 during the years between 1845 and 1852, in accounts recorded much later, when someone finally thought to ask, was not the door itself, but the sound it sometimes made. Not a knock. Not a voice. A sound closer to pressure, as if something on the other side were leaning against the wood. Testing it, perhaps. Or simply resting against it, the way a person rests against a door when they are too tired to stand unsupported and the door is the nearest solid thing. The Marsh family, who occupied the room at the top of the first flight of stairs, had developed a habit, unconscious, they would later insist, though habits of that particular specificity are rarely entirely unconscious, of not looking at the door when they pass through the corridor. The eldest child, a girl of 11 named Clara, had taken to descending the stairs with her eyes fixed on the step directly in front of her feet, and ascending them the same way. Her mother had noticed this and said nothing. There were things in number 26 that were better addressed by habit than by conversation. In the winter of 1847, a man who had recently moved into the ground floor room, the one adjacent to the corridor, separated from it by a wall thin enough that sound passed through it with almost no resistance, told his neighbor that he had heard, on 3 separate occasions, what he could only describe as counting. Low. Deliberate. In a register that made it difficult to determine whether the voice belonged to an adult or a child. His neighbor listened to this without expression and then asked how the man's wife was keeping, and the conversation moved on, and the counting was not mentioned again. No one opened the door. This was not discussed. It did not need to be. There are agreements that form between people in shared spaces, agreements that are never spoken aloud because speaking them aloud would require acknowledging that they exist, and acknowledging that they exist would require explaining why, and explaining why would require a kind of honesty about the nature of the place they were all living in that no one on Field Lane had the energy, or perhaps the courage, to sustain. The door remained closed. At night, when the corridor was completely dark and the building had settled into whatever version of quiet it was capable of producing, which was never entirely quiet, because 12 families in 4 floors produce a constant low register of sound even in sleep, breath and turning and the occasional cry of a child that stops as quickly as it starts. At night, the corridor was simply a space between things. Between the street and the stairs. Between the outside and the above. Between whatever was on the other side of that door and everything else. On the morning of the 14th of November, 1847, a woman crossing the corridor before dawn, she worked at a laundry on Farringdon Street, the shift beginning at 5, the walk taking 20 minutes in good weather and longer in the dark, noticed that the door was not entirely closed. A gap. Perhaps 2 inches. No light from within. No sound. She did not stop. She told herself, later, that she had not had time. That the shift began at 5 and the walk took 20 minutes and she could not afford to be late again. These things were true. She did not look inside. By the time she returned that evening, the door was closed again. Fully. As if it had never been otherwise. She hung up her coat. She did not mention it to anyone. The corridor held its shape around the silence the way it always had, patiently, and without any indication that it intended to explain itself. The room measured 14 feet by 11. This was not an estimate. It was recorded, precisely, in the neat and slightly impatient handwriting of a parish inspector named Gerald Howell, who visited number 26 in April of 1848 and spent 40 minutes in the building before leaving and writing his report in a coffee house 3 streets away, where the air was different and the chairs did not shift under weight in the way that the chairs in the building had. 14 feet by 11. He noted the dimensions. He noted the single window, north-facing, the lower pane cracked and covered on the inside with a piece of oilcloth that had been there long enough to have darkened at the edges. He noted the fireplace, present, functional in theory, not in use at the time of his visit despite the temperature. He did not note the reason it was not in use. Coal cost money. Some things did not require notation. What Gerald Howell also noted, in the careful neutral language that official documents of the period favored for observations that might otherwise have required a response: 6 occupants. 2 adults. 4 children. In a room of 14 feet by 11. He recorded this. He moved on to the next room. The report was filed. Nothing changed. The Marsh family had lived in that room for 3 years by the time of Howell's visit. Thomas Marsh worked at a tannery near Bermondsey, a walk of almost an hour each way, 6 days a week, in boots that had been resoled twice and were approaching the limit of what resoling could accomplish. His wife, Ellen, took in mending. The work came irregularly, in quantities that bore no reliable relationship to the family's needs, arriving in bundles when it was least expected and disappearing for stretches of 2 or 3 weeks with no explanation and no recourse. The 4 children, Clara, 11, William, 8, the twins, both 5, named James and an unnamed one in the records, referred to only as the other, attended the Ragged School on Saffron Hill on the days when attendance was possible, which was not every day, and not reliably the same days from one week to the next. In the room, they managed. That was the word Ellen Marsh used, in the account recorded 15 years later by a journalist documenting the clearances. Managed. Not survived. Not endured. Managed. As if the room were a problem that could be solved through sufficient organization, the straw mattresses arranged against the wall during the day to create a space that functioned as something other than a sleeping area, the single pot kept clean through a discipline that the journalist, who had never had to apply discipline to a single pot, described as remarkable. Ellen Marsh did not find it remarkable. She found it Tuesday. Clara had stopped speaking 3 weeks before Howell's visit. Not entirely. She responded when directly addressed, in the minimal way that indicates compliance rather than engagement. The way a person answers a question when answering is the path of least resistance. But the spontaneous speech, the commentary, the questions, the particular running observation that children of 11 produce almost continuously when they are well, that had stopped. Quietly. Without announcement. The way things stop in rooms where there is not enough space to make stopping into an event. Thomas had noticed. He had mentioned it to Ellen on a Sunday evening, in the low voice that the room required of all conversations that were not intended for all 6 of its occupants. Ellen had said that Clara was tired. That they were all tired. That it would pass. Thomas had looked at his daughter, who was sitting near the window with her back to the room, looking at the oilcloth over the cracked pane as if she could see through it to something on the other side. He had not disagreed with his wife. Disagreement required energy that Sunday evenings did not reliably provide. Gerald Howell had not noted Clara in his report. He had noted 4 children, ages approximate, and had moved on. Clara was one of the 4. She was present during his visit, sitting in the same position near the window, her back to the inspector, her attention apparently fixed on the oilcloth. Howell had not addressed her directly. She had not turned around. The window faced north. Through the oilcloth, on the days when the light was strong enough and the cloth thin enough in places to allow it, a pale and filtered version of the afternoon arrived in the room, not warm, not illuminating, not particularly useful. But present. Something that had come from outside and made it in. Clara sat near it on most afternoons. Whether she was watching it or simply positioning herself in its vicinity, whether there was a distinction between those 2 things for a child of 11 in a room of 14 feet by 11, was not something anyone had asked her. She had not volunteered the information. The twins slept against the far wall. William had a cough that came at night and departed before morning, reliably, like a visitor who had learned the schedule of the household. Thomas left before 5. Ellen was usually already awake. The room managed. That was the word. On the other side of the wall shared with the corridor, the wall through which sound passed as if the plaster were a suggestion rather than a barrier, something shifted that evening just before dark. Clara turned from the window. She looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother. Ellen did not look up from the mending. Clara turned back to the window. She did not say what she had heard. She had not said much of anything in 3 weeks. There was no particular reason to think this would be different. The room held its 14 feet by 11 around all of them. Outside, the lane was going dark. The building had been profitable for 11 years before anyone who owned it set foot inside it. This was not negligence, precisely. Or rather, it was negligence of a kind so thoroughly systematized, so built into the structure of how property functioned in London in the 1840s, that calling it negligence implied the existence of an alternative that the men involved would have found genuinely difficult to imagine. A property generated income. Income was collected. The property continued to generate income. The logic was complete. What happened inside the property between one rent collection and the next was a matter for the people inside it, and the people inside it paid their rent, or most of them did, most of the time, which was the only information the system required of them. Number 26 had passed through 3 owners between 1836 and 1847. The first had purchased it as part of a larger acquisition of 6 properties on Field Lane and the surrounding streets, a transaction conducted entirely on paper, the buildings represented by figures in a ledger, the figures satisfactory, the transaction complete. He died in 1841 without having visited any of the 6. His estate passed the properties to his son, who held them for 4 years and then sold them to a man named Aldous Pembridge, a draper from Cheapside who had been advised by his solicitor that property in Holborn represented a reasonable return on capital and who had accepted this advice without requesting additional detail. Pembridge was the owner of record in 1847. He was also, by every available measure, entirely absent from the story of the building, except in one respect. Every quarter, without fail, the rent arrived. It was collected by an agent named Sutton, a small, efficient man who appeared at number 26 on the first Monday of March, June, September, and December, knocked on each door in sequence, received what was owed or negotiated what was partially owed, recorded the figures in a small leather book, and departed. Sutton had been collecting rents on Field Lane for 9 years. He was familiar with the building in the way that a postal carrier is familiar with a street. He knew its surface, its schedule, its patterns of resistance and compliance. He did not know, and had not been asked to assess, the state of the ceiling on the 2nd floor, which had been visibly deteriorating since the winter of 1844. The ceiling in question covered the room occupied by a widow named Agnes Fowler and her 2 adult sons. It had begun as a stain, circular, approximately the diameter of a dinner plate, appearing in the far corner after a period of heavy rain in November of that year. By the following spring it had expanded to cover roughly a third of the ceiling's surface. By the winter of 1845 it had begun to soften, the plaster becoming friable at the edges of the stain, releasing a fine pale dust when disturbed, which it was disturbed regularly by the footsteps of whoever lived in the room above. By 1847 a section approximately 2 feet across had developed a visible sag, a gentle depression in the surface, as if the ceiling were inhaling slowly and had forgotten to exhale. Agnes Fowler had reported this to Sutton in September of 1845. She had shown him the stain. Sutton had looked at it with the expression of a man performing an assessment he has no authority to act upon, noted something in his small leather book, and told her he would pass the information to Mr. Pembridge. Agnes had thanked him. She had continued to pay her rent each quarter. The ceiling had continued its slow transformation. In December of 1846, Sutton's book shows a second notation beside the entry for Agnes Fowler's room. The notation reads, "Ceiling, reported again." This is the complete notation. There is no corresponding entry in any record associated with Aldous Pembridge, no instruction issued, no repair commissioned, no response of any kind that survived in documentary form. Either Pembridge received the report and chose not to act, or Sutton's small leather book held information that never travelled further than Sutton's pocket. The distinction, from the perspective of Agnes Fowler's ceiling, was immaterial. Pembridge visited the building once. This is documented, not in his own records, which do not survive, but in a letter written by his solicitor in March of 1848, referencing a visit made the previous autumn. The letter concerns an unrelated matter, a boundary dispute with a neighbouring property, and mentions the visit only in passing, as evidence that Pembridge had direct knowledge of the building's location. The solicitor notes that Pembridge found the property in order. He does not specify what in order meant, or which parts of the property Pembridge inspected, or whether he reached the second floor, or whether, if he did, he looked up. The visit lasted, according to the letter, approximately 20 minutes. He did not return. The rent continued to arrive each quarter. The ceiling continued its slow descent. Agnes Fowler continued to sleep in the room beneath it, in the corner furthest from the sag, which her sons had pointed out to her without discussion, the way families in confined spaces communicate the most important things, through arrangement rather than speech. In February of 1848, a section of the ceiling approximately 18 inches across came down during the night. No one was struck. The plaster landed on the floor in the corner nearest the window, not the corner where Agnes slept, not the area her sons occupied. The corner that was used for storage. A sack of coal that had been there since Christmas was partially buried. Agnes stood in the doorway of the room in the dark and looked at the hole where the ceiling had been, and at the exposed timber above it, black with moisture, and at the pale debris on the floor, and she did not wake her sons. In the morning she wrote a letter to Aldous Pembridge at the address Sutton had provided years earlier when she had first asked. She described the collapse in precise and restrained language. She noted the date. She noted that she had reported the deterioration twice to the collection agent. She asked, without demanding, the letter is careful about this, careful in the way that people are careful when they understand that demanding is a luxury not available to them. She asked that the ceiling be assessed and repaired. The letter was sent. There is no record of a reply. Above the hole, the exposed timber continued to do what it had been doing for years, slowly, silently, and without any particular interest in what happened below it. The rent was due in March. Agnes paid it. She is listed in the parish records as M. Dalton. Nothing before the initial. No first name recorded in any document associated with the building, the street, the parish, or the period. M. Dalton. The M could have stood for any number of things: Margaret, Mary, Martha, Millicent, names common enough in London in the 1840s that the absence of the full version feels less like an oversight and more like a decision. As if whoever recorded her name had looked at her and determined that an initial was sufficient. That she was the kind of person for whom an initial was sufficient. She occupied the front room on the second floor, the better room on that landing, in the sense that its window faced the lane rather than the interior courtyard, which meant that on clear days a version of actual daylight reached it, briefly, in the late morning, before the angle of the sun moved past the narrow gap between the buildings and the room returned to its customary grey. She had lived there since at least 1843, which was as far back as Sutton's records went for that particular room. Whether she had been there before 1843 was not recorded. Whether she had come from somewhere else, or had always been on Field Lane, or had arrived the way many people arrived on Field Lane, gradually, through a series of smaller rooms in slightly better streets, each move representing not a choice but a subtraction, was not recorded either. What was noted, by two separate residents of the building, in accounts given years apart to different people for different purposes, was that M. Dalton spoke to the walls. Not continuously. Not in the manner of someone whose grip on the distinction between interior and exterior thought had become unreliable. Deliberately. In a low, even voice, at specific times of day, most often in the early evening, after the light had gone from the window and before the building had fully settled into its night rhythms. The woman from the laundry, the same woman who had seen the corridor door ajar in November, lived in the room directly below and could hear the voice through the floor but not the words. She described it as steady. Like someone reading aloud to themselves, she said. Except that M. Dalton, as far as anyone knew, did not own any books. The other account came from a man named Reeves who had briefly occupied the room across the landing, 6 weeks in the spring of 1849, before he found work in Birmingham and left. Reeves had heard the voice through the wall on multiple occasions and had once, on an evening when his own room felt particularly small and the building particularly close, stood in the corridor and listened. He told the person who recorded his account that the voice had been entirely calm. That it had not sounded distressed. That it had sounded, if anything, like a person delivering information, specific, considered, in sequence. As if she were giving an account of something. As if the wall had asked, and she were answering. What she was saying, Reeves could not determine. The wall between the corridor and her room was thicker than most in the building, original construction, not a later addition, and it absorbed the content while allowing the rhythm through. He stood in the corridor for perhaps 4 minutes. Then a door opened somewhere above him and he moved away, and he did not stand there again. M. Dalton worked. This much is clear from the rent records, which show consistent payment across the years she occupied the room, with only 2 gaps, both in winter, both of 1 quarter's duration, both made up in the following payment with what Sutton's book records as an arrangement. What the work was is not documented. Women on Field Lane in the 1840s worked in ways that did not always generate records, taking in laundry, making matchboxes, sewing at rates that required 16 hours of work to produce a day's subsistence. The nature of M. Dalton's particular contribution to the household economy of number 26 was not something the parish inspectors thought to ask about, and not something she offered. She was described, in the one physical description that survives, a sentence in Reeves's account, almost an afterthought, as a woman of middle age, neat in her dress, with a way of moving through the building that suggested she knew exactly where everything was and had made her peace with it. Reeves used the phrase "made her peace with it." He seemed to mean it as a compliment. It is possible he was right. On the evenings when she spoke to the wall, the building was quieter around her room than around any other. This is not something that can be verified, it is an impression, assembled from fragments, from the way 2 people independently describe the sound of her voice in relation to the sounds of everything else. But the impression is consistent. The building seemed to listen. Or perhaps, and this distinction matters less than it might appear to, the building had simply always been listening, and M. Dalton was the only person in number 26 who had noticed and decided to respond. The walls of that room, when the building was finally demolished in 1864, were found to be covered in marks. Not drawings, not the kind of images a child makes when left alone with something sharp and a surface. Marks of a different kind. Regular. Grouped. The workman who found them stood in the half-demolished room for a moment before bringing his tool down on the wall. He did not record what he thought they were. He may not have known. He may have known precisely, and found that knowing was not something he wanted to carry out of the room with him. M. Dalton left number 26 in 1851. The rent record shows her room as vacant from the June quarter of that year. Where she went is not documented. Whether she chose to go, or was displaced, or simply stopped, in the way that people on Field Lane sometimes simply stopped, quietly, without generating the kind of paperwork that would allow a record to follow them, is not known. The room was re-let within the month. The new tenants did not mention the marks on the walls. Either they did not notice them, or they noticed them and decided, as people in that building had decided about many things, that some observations were better left inside the room where they were made. If this story has settled somewhere unexpected in you, somewhere you did not anticipate when it began, a like is the quietest way to say so. The archive notices. The courtyard was not on the building's original plan either. It had been a garden once, or something that the person who built the surrounding structures in 1801 had designated as a garden, in the optimistic way that developers of the period sometimes designated spaces that were too small and too dark and too enclosed to function as anything else. By 1820 it had become a yard. By 1835 it had become the kind of space that exists in cities between buildings that have grown too close together, a residual geometry, defined entirely by what surrounds it rather than by any purpose of its own. Approximately 20 feet by 15. Stone underfoot, the original paving having long since settled into a pattern of irregularity that collected water in specific places after rain, the same places every time, reliable as clocks. No direct sunlight after 10 in the morning. A single drain in the southeast corner that functioned intermittently and which no one had authority to repair. The well was in the center. It had been there as long as any resident of the surrounding buildings could remember, which in practice meant as long as they had lived there, which in most cases was not long enough to constitute historical memory but was long enough to constitute assumption. The well was there. It had always been there. It provided water. These three facts existed in the minds of the people who used it in the same undifferentiated category as the existence of the lane itself, or the existence of the cold, as conditions, not as choices, and therefore not as things that required examination. The water tasted of something. This was also known, in the same unexamined way. A mineral quality, not unpleasant, exactly, in the way that unpleasant implies a clear negative response. More a presence than a taste. Something additional, underneath the water itself, that the water carried without being asked to. The residents of number 26 had been drinking it for years. The residents of the adjacent buildings on the courtyard, number 24, number 28, the rear of the property on Vine Street whose occupants shared access through a narrow passage on the eastern side, had been drinking it longer. No one had become acutely ill from it, in the sudden and unambiguous way that acute illness presents itself. This was taken as evidence of safety. It was not evidence of safety. It was evidence of a slower process, one that did not announce itself, that accumulated in the body the way dampness accumulates in walls, invisibly, over time, until the surface finally shows what the interior has known for years. In the spring of 1848, an inspector from the Metropolitan Commission of Sores visited the area around Field Lane as part of a broader survey of water sources in Holborn. His name was Francis Callow. He was 26 years old, recently appointed, and possessed of the specific combination of competence and powerlessness that characterized junior officials of his period. He understood what he was seeing, he had the language to describe it accurately, and he had almost no capacity to compel anyone to act on his descriptions. He visited the courtyard on a Tuesday afternoon in April. He examined the well. He took a sample of the water in a glass vial, which he labeled and placed in a leather case alongside 11 other vials from other addresses visited that day. He noted in his field book, proximity to cesspit, eastern wall, estimated distance 4 feet. Visible seepage at well base. Water discolored under examination. Recommend suspension of use pending further assessment. He submitted his report to the Commission the following week. The report was received. It was assigned a reference number. It was placed in a sequence of reports awaiting review, behind 14 other reports from other areas of the city, each of which described conditions of varying severity, each of which had been assigned a reference number, each of which was awaiting the same review. The Commission was understaffed. The city was large. The reports accumulated at a rate that the review process was not designed to match. Callow's report on the Field Lane Courtyard well moved through this system at the pace the system permitted, which was not the pace the well required. No notice was posted. No instruction was issued to the residents of the surrounding buildings. The well continued to be used, morning and evening, by the women of the households primarily, who carried the water up the stairs in whatever vessels the household possessed, who boiled what they had fuel to boil and used the rest as it was. The children drank it. The elderly drank it. The Marsh children drank it. William, whose cough came at night and left before morning, drank it every day. In August of 1848, Francis Callow submitted a follow-up note to his original report, flagging it for priority review on the grounds that 4 months had elapsed without action. The note was attached to the original report. The combined document continued to move through the system at the same pace. Callow was reassigned to a survey of water sources in Southwark in September and did not return to Field Lane in any official capacity. The well did not look different from any other well. This was the central difficulty, not that the danger was hidden, exactly, but that it was invisible in the way that most of the danger on Field Lane was invisible. Not concealed behind a locked door or a deliberate deception, but simply present in a form that the eye could not register and the body could not immediately report. The water was drawn. The water was carried upstairs. The water was used. The sequence was so familiar, so embedded in the daily rhythm of every household in the courtyard, that interrupting it would have required an external instruction that never came, a notice on the wall, a word from someone with authority, something that said, "Stop. What you are doing is harming you. Stop." No such instruction came. Callow's report remained in the Commission's files. The reference number remained legible for many years, the ink was good quality, the paper reasonably well preserved. The report itself was eventually discovered by a researcher in 1911, 63 years after it was written, during an archival review of pre-cholera documentation in the Holborn area. The researcher noted that the well had served the courtyard for at least another 2 years after Callow's report. She noted this. She moved on to the next document. In the courtyard below, the drain in the southeast corner continued its intermittent function. The water collected in the same places after rain. The same places, every time. Reliable as clocks. They left before the street was light. This was not a figure of speech. In November, in London, in 1848, first light arrived at approximately 7:40 in the morning. The children of Field Lane who worked, and not all of them did, and not all of them worked the same hours, and not all of them worked at the same things, but a significant number of them, enough to constitute a pattern visible to anyone who looked out of a window at the right hour, left before that. At 5, sometimes earlier. In the dark that was not yet thinning, that still had the quality of night rather than the quality of early morning, the particular density of dark that feels permanent rather than temporary. They moved through it the way people move through familiar darkness, not confidently, but without surprise. Knowing where the uneven stone was. Knowing which part of the lane flooded when it rained and had not yet drained. Knowing, without having been taught in any formal sense, everything the street required of them in order to move through it without incident. From number 26, in the autumn of 1848, 4 children made this journey on a regular basis. Clara Marsh, now 12, had found work at a small manufactory on Leather Lane that produced artificial flowers, wire frames, paper petals, dye applied by hand, the finished products sold to milliners and market stalls throughout the city. The work required fine motor precision and tolerance for the dye, which stained the fingers and did not wash out completely, and which Clara's hands showed at all times in a faint blue-green cast that her mother had stopped trying to remove. She left at 5:30. She returned at 7:30 in the evening. She was still not speaking much. The work, if anything, seemed to have given her silence a different quality, less like withdrawal, more like something she had decided on and was maintaining with intention. William Marsh, now 9, swept and ran errands for a chandler's shop on Holborn Hill. The work was irregular. He was called when needed and not called when not, which meant his income was impossible to anticipate, and his days had a quality of provisional suspension, waiting at the door of the shop to be seen and assessed and either employed or turned away. On the days he was turned away, he sometimes walked to Smithfield and watched the market, not because he enjoyed it, but because returning to the room before the expected time required an explanation, and explanations in the Marsh household consumed resources that were better preserved. His cough had not improved. He did not mention it. No one in the family mentioned it. There was a form of collective agreement operating around William's cough that resembled, from the outside, denial, but was in fact something more practical, an acknowledgement that the cough existed within a set of conditions that the family could not alter, and that speaking about it would not alter them, and that the energy required for speaking about it was energy that had other necessary applications. The other 2 children from the building who made the pre-dawn journey were not from the Marsh family. A boy of 10 named Patrick, from the 3rd floor. His surname does not appear consistently in the records, listed variously as Heaney, Haney, and on one occasion simply as the Irish boy, which tells you something about the record keeper and rather less about Patrick, worked at a bone-boiling yard near King's Cross. The work was the kind of work that existed at the absolute lower boundary of what the period's labour market offered. Foul-smelling, physically demanding, compensated at rates that reflected its position at that boundary precisely. Patrick had been doing it since he was 8. He was small for 10. He ate whatever was available and was hungry the rest of the time, which was most of the time, in the specific ongoing way that is different from the acute hunger of missing a meal, a background condition, a permanent low register of need that the body eventually stops reporting as urgency and begins to incorporate as normal. The 4th child was a girl whose name appears in the records only as Bess. She sold watercress from a basket near Holborn Circus, acquiring the cress from a supplier on Farringdon Road at 4 in the morning, arranging it in the basket during the walk, beginning to sell at 5 or 5:30 depending on the season and the weather and the foot traffic, which she had learned to read the way a farmer reads weather, not from any single sign but from a combination of small indications assembled into a judgment that was usually correct and occasionally catastrophically wrong. She was 9, or possibly 8. The record is uncertain. She was the youngest of the 4 who left before light, and she walked the fastest, and she was the one who knew the street best, its rhythms, its dangers, its particular grammar of who moved where and when and why. She had the quality, visible in certain children who have learned the city from the inside rather than from instruction, of knowing exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy and occupying precisely that much, no more, with a kind of calibrated invisibility that was not natural to childhood but had become natural to her. On a Tuesday in the second week of November, 1848, Bess did not return. This is what the records show, or rather, this is what the absence in the records shows, which is not the same thing but is the only form in which it survives. She was present on the Monday. She was not present on the Wednesday. What happened on the Tuesday, whether she was taken ill, whether she encountered something on the route she walked before dawn, whether she made a decision, or had a decision made for her, or simply ceased to be present in the way that people in the margins of records sometimes cease to be present, by moving laterally out of whatever thin band of documentation had been tracking them, is not recorded. No one at number 26 filed a report. This was not indifference, or not only indifference. It was an understanding, accumulated through experience, of what reports accomplished for people in their position, which was generally nothing, and occasionally something worse than nothing. It was also an understanding that Bess existed at the edge of the community of the building, known, recognized, present, but not attached to it in the ways that generate formal concern. She had no family in the building whose absence would register as a vacancy requiring explanation. She had a basket and a route and a supplier on Farringdon Road who, presumably, found another girl to buy the cress on Wednesday morning without significant disruption to his schedule. Clara Marsh left for the flour manufactory on the Wednesday as usual. She walked the first part of the route at the same time she always did, in the dark that was not yet thinning. She passed the place on Holborn Circus where Bess usually stood with her basket in the early morning. The place was empty. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she kept walking. She did not mention it when she returned that evening. There was no one to mention it to who did not already know, and knowing, had already decided, in the way the building had taught all of them to decide, that some absences were better held quietly than examined in the light. The following Monday, a different girl was selling watercress at Holborn Circus. She was also small. She was also fast. She had also learned, or was in the process of learning, exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy. The city did not pause for the transition. It never did. The word arrived before the disease did. This was always how it happened, not the word cholera, exactly, which was a clinical term that moved through the city in official channels, in reports and commission minutes and the correspondence of medical men. A different word. Several words, in fact, assembling themselves into a kind of atmospheric pressure that settled over certain streets before any case was confirmed, before any death was recorded, before any of the machinery of official response had been activated. The words were, "It is coming," or "It has started," or simply, "Have you heard?" Spoken in the particular register of information that is too important to deliver loudly and too urgent to withhold, low, direct, with a compression of people who have learned that the distance between hearing something and needing to act on it is shorter than most people in more comfortable circumstances understand. By January of 1849, it was on Saffron Hill. This was 3 streets from Field Lane. 3 streets, in this part of Holborn, was not a significant distance. It was a distance that could be covered in 4 minutes at an ordinary pace, in 2 at the pace that fear produces. The cases on Saffron Hill were confirmed by a parish doctor named Whitmore, who recorded them in his register with the same handwriting he used for everything else, steady, professional, giving nothing away, and who had seen cholera before, in 1832, when he had been a medical student and the city had not yet learned what it was dealing with, and who understood with a clarity that his steady handwriting did not express what the proximity of those cases to Field Lane meant for the people living on it. Number 26 had not yet been touched. This was the word used, touched, as if the disease were a hand moving through the city, selecting, making contact, withdrawing. The building had not been touched. The word yet was not spoken aloud, but it was present in every sentence that contained the word not, hanging there, implicit, doing its patient work. The Marsh family had heard about Saffron Hill on the same evening the first case was confirmed. Thomas had heard it at the tannery, from a man who had a cousin on that street. He had come home and told Ellen in the low voice reserved for information the children were not intended to receive, which in a room of 14 feet by 11 was a voice that the children received regardless. Clara had been sitting near the window with her back to the room. She had not turned around. But her shoulders had changed, a barely perceptible adjustment, a slight shift in the set of them, the kind of physical response that the body produces when it has heard something and the mind has not yet decided what to do with it. William's cough had worsened through December. Not dramatically. Nothing about William's deterioration was dramatic, which was part of why it had been possible to maintain the collective silence around it for as long as the family had. It was a worsening in degree rather than in kind, the same cough, arriving at the same time, lasting longer, taking slightly more out of him than it had taken the week before. He was still going to the Chandlers on the days he was called. He was still returning with whatever he had earned and placing it on the table without being asked. He was thinner than he had been in the autumn. His eyes had the quality that eyes get when the body is directing its resources inward, not dull, exactly, but concentrated, as if the outward-facing functions were being managed with a reduced allocation. Ellen had begun boiling all the water. She had not announced this decision or explained it. She had simply begun doing it, heating whatever water she drew from the courtyard well before any of it was used for anything, using fuel she could not easily spare, maintaining the practice with the same quiet determination she brought to every other aspect of managing the room. Whether she understood the mechanism, the connection between contaminated water and the disease moving through Saffron Hill, is not possible to know from the record. What is possible to know is that she had heard something, from someone, at some point, that had produced this change in her behavior. Women on Field Lane shared information about survival the way they shared everything else that mattered, quietly, specifically, without ceremony, in the margins of other conversations, in the brief exchanges that happened on the stairs or in the courtyard at the well, passing between them the small technical knowledge of how to keep people alive in conditions that were not designed for keeping people alive. On the street, the precautions were inconsistent and improvised. Some families burned vinegar, following advice of uncertain origin that circulated through the area with considerable conviction. Some families avoided the courtyard entirely and walked further to draw water from a street pump on Holborn Hill, which was no safer but felt safer because it was further away from the buildings where people were sick. Some families did nothing differently, not from ignorance or indifference, but from the particular paralysis that descends when the list of things to fear becomes long enough that prioritizing among them requires more cognitive resources than are available after a working day of the length that Field Lane produced. The building watched the street and the street watched itself. This was the atmosphere of those weeks, a watchfulness that was not quite fear, because fear implies the possibility of escape, and most of the people on Field Lane understood with great precision that their options for escape were limited in ways that had nothing to do with cholera and everything to do with the conditions that had placed them on Field Lane in the first instance. They watched. They waited. They continued to go to work before light and return after dark because the alternative to going to work was a sequence of events: missed rent, eviction, the street, that was in its own way as threatening as whatever was moving through Saffron Hill. By the end of January, the cases on Saffron Hill had spread to 2 adjacent streets. Neither of those streets was Field Lane. The building had still not been touched. The word yet continued its patient work, unsaid, present in the walls. Clara left for the flour manufactory each morning. She passed through the courtyard, past the well, out through the passage on the eastern side. She walked the route she always walked. She passed the place at Holborn Circus where Bess no longer stood. She arrived at the manufactory. She sat at the bench with the wire frames and the paper petals and the dye that did not wash out. She worked with the same contained precision she brought to everything now, economic, deliberate, producing the required number of flowers per hour, neither more nor less. On the walk home one evening in early February, she passed a house on Leather Lane with a notice in the window. She could read. The ragged school on Saffron Hill had given her that, at least, before attendance had become impossible. She stopped. She read the notice. She stood there for a moment in the cold. Then she continued walking. She did not tell anyone what the notice said. She had not told anyone much of anything for months. But that evening, for the first time since the autumn, she sat at the table instead of near the window, close enough to the lamp that its light reached her face, and she looked at William for a long time while he ate. William did not look up. His cough came that night, as it always did. In the morning he dressed and went to the chandler's. The building had still not been touched. The word yet pressed quietly against every wall. He arrived on a Wednesday morning in March of 1849, at 20 minutes past 9. His name was Edmund Farr. He was 34 years old, employed by the Metropolitan Commission of Sores as a sanitary inspector, a title that had existed, in its current form, for less than 2 years, created by legislation that had itself been created by the pressure of events that the city had been building toward for the better part of a decade without quite arriving at until the pressure became impossible to redirect. Farr had been a schoolteacher before this. The transition was less unusual than it might appear. The work of a sanitary inspector in 1849 required literacy, numeracy, the ability to move through spaces that resisted being moved through, and a tolerance for what those spaces contained. Teaching in a ragged school had prepared him for most of these requirements more directly than any formal training could have. He came with a printed form. The form had been designed by a committee and revised twice and contained 47 questions, organized under 7 headings, covering the physical condition of the dwelling, the number of occupants, the sanitary arrangements, the water source, the state of the drainage, the condition of the shared spaces, and a final section headed General Observations, which was where inspectors placed everything the 47 questions had failed to anticipate, which in practice meant everything that mattered most. Farr had completed this form, or versions of it, in over 200 dwellings in the preceding 8 months. He had developed a method, efficient, unhurried, designed to minimize the disruption to the occupants while extracting the information the form required. He knocked. He introduced himself. He explained the purpose of the visit in plain language. He asked his questions. He wrote down what he found. He left. Number 26 took him 1 hour and 40 minutes. This was longer than his average. The building resisted the form in ways that buildings on Field Lane consistently did, presenting conditions that the 47 questions had not been designed to accommodate and that the general observation section was not large enough to fully receive. He began on the ground floor and worked upward, knocking on each door in sequence, recording what each room contained, what each room lacked, what each room showed him without being asked. He noted the corridor. He noted the door at the end of it, which was closed. He tried the handle. It did not open. He noted, locked or sealed, Access not obtained. He moved on. He did not note what he had felt when the handle failed to turn, the particular quality of resistance that a door produces when it has been closed for a long time, when the wood has settled into the frame with the permanence of something that was not intended to open again. The form did not have a question for that. The Marsh room took 11 minutes. Thomas was at work. Clara was at the manufactory. William had not been called to the Chandlers that day and was present, sitting near the window in the position that had been Clara's and which he had apparently adopted in her absence, looking at the oilcloth over the cracked pane with the same quality of attention she had brought to it. Farr noted him, age approximately 9, present during inspection, appears thin, persistent cough observed during visit. He noted the room's dimensions, confirming Howell's figures from the previous year. He noted the fireplace, present, not in use. He noted the water vessel near the door, which contained boiled water, still faintly warm. He asked Ellen Marsh where the household's water came from. She told him. He noted, Courtyard well, eastern aspect. He wrote, beneath this, see separate well notation. He already knew about the well. Callow's report had been in the Commission's files for almost a year. It had been reviewed, finally, in February, one of the 14 reports ahead of it having been resolved, creating space in the queue. Farr had read it before making his visit. He had not told Ellen Marsh this. He asked her how long the child had been coughing. Ellen looked at him with the expression of a person being asked a question by someone who has the authority to make things better and the experience to know they probably will not. She said, some months. Farr wrote, child presents with chronic respiratory symptoms, duration several months, no medical attention received. He paused. He wrote, beneath this, in slightly smaller letters, as if reducing the size of the observation might reduce its weight, recommend assessment. He underlined it. Then he closed his notebook and thanked her and moved to the next room. Agnes Fowler's ceiling had been partially repaired, a temporary measure, boards placed over the hole, not plastered, not finished, but structurally sufficient to prevent further collapse. Farr noted this. He noted that the repair had been made by Agnes's sons using materials they had acquired themselves, without instruction or assistance from the building's owner. He noted the remaining staining on the surrounding plaster, the continued presence of moisture in the timber above the boards, the probability that the repair was temporary in a way that the people who had made it could not afford it to be. The room the form identified as uncertain occupancy, the attic space, produced 17 minutes of the inspection's additional length. Farr climbed the final stairs, which were narrower than the others and steeper, the treads worn in a pattern that suggested regular use rather than occasional access. The door at the top was not locked. It opened into a space that the word attic did not adequately describe, lower on the left side where the roofline descended, higher in the center, lit by a single skylight through which the March sky was visible in a rectangle approximately 18 inches by 12. The space was not empty. It contained evidence of habitation, a blanket, folded with some care and placed against the higher wall. A tin cup. A candle burned to within an inch of its base, set on a piece of stone that served as a holder. And along the lower wall, where the roofline met the floor, marks in the plaster. Regular. Grouped in fives, the fifth drawn through the previous four. Farr counted them. He stopped counting at 112 and noted, marks consistent with counting of days. Duration suggested, minimum 16 weeks. No occupant was present. No occupant was encountered during the inspection or named by any of the other residents when Farr asked, carefully, whether anyone was known to use the upper space. The answers he received were consistent in their brevity and their direction, not denials, exactly, but responses shaped to provide the minimum information required to constitute a response. He noted this too. He noted everything. He completed the inspection at 11 o'clock. He stood in the corridor for a moment before leaving, at the entrance, near the front door, looking toward the staircase and the door beside it that had not opened. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he went out into the lane. He submitted his report to the Commission on Friday of that week. The report was thorough. It was accurate. It described, in the careful administrative language the form required, conditions that the language could carry but not quite convey, the distance between what the words said and what the rooms had felt like being a distance that every report of this kind contained and that no revision of the form had yet managed to close. He had written, in the general observations section, more than any other inspector had written in that section for a property of this size. He had filled it completely and continued on the reverse, which was not standard practice. He had written, conditions throughout present a pattern of compounded deficiency in which no single element can be addressed in isolation. He had written, the well requires immediate closure. He had written, the child on the first floor requires medical assessment without delay. He had signed the report. He had folded it. He had placed it in the Commission's submission box at the offices on Greek Street. Then he had walked to a chop house on Soho Square and eaten his lunch. The report entered the system. The system received it. In the building on Field Lane, William Marsh coughed through another night, and the well stood in the courtyard as it always had, and the marks on the attic wall held their count at 112, and the door in the corridor remained exactly as Edmund Farr had found it. Closed. Settled into its frame. Not intending to open. The date is not certain. This is not unusual. Deaths in buildings like number 26 did not always generate the paperwork that deaths in other kinds of buildings generated, not because the people who lived there were less, but because the systems designed to record them were built around assumptions of regularity that Field Lane did not meet. A death required a doctor's confirmation, or a coroner's, and doctors and coroners moved through this part of Holborn on schedules that were not always responsive to the pace of events inside it. What can be established is that sometime in the last week of March, 1849, someone died in number 26 Field Lane. The body was removed in the early morning. The neighbours heard it happen. No one came out to look. The parish register for St Andrew Holborn shows 2 entries that could correspond to the event, both from the first days of April, both listing Field Lane as the address of the deceased, both recording cause of death in the compressed and sometimes approximate language of parish clerks managing a period of elevated mortality. The first entry is for a man, age estimated at 50, cause recorded as fever and debility. The second is for a child, age not given, cause recorded as convulsions. Which of these was the first death in number 26? Whether either of them was, is not possible to determine from the record alone. What the building's residents understood was simpler than any register entry. Someone who had been there was not there anymore. The room they had occupied, whichever room it was, had a different quality to it in the days that followed. Not silence, because the building was never entirely silent. Something closer to a held breath. The particular quality of a space that has been altered by subtraction and has not yet settled into what it will be after. Thomas Marsh heard the removal from the room on the first floor. He was awake. He was usually awake before 5, the body having learned the schedule the tannery imposed and maintaining it even on the mornings when the tannery did not require it. He heard the footsteps in the corridor below. More than 2 sets. The particular quality of movement that several people produce when they are trying to be quiet and are not entirely succeeding. A sound of something being managed, carefully, with effort, in the narrow space of the corridor. Then the front door. Then the lane. Then nothing. He did not wake Ellen. He lay in the dark and listened to the building return to its ordinary sounds. William's breathing, which had the faint irregular quality it always had now, and the twins against the far wall, and somewhere above, the particular creak of the attic floor that appeared at random intervals through the night, reliable as ever, sourceless as ever. He listened until the sounds arranged themselves back into the pattern he knew. Then he dressed and went to work. Clara left at her usual time. She passed through the corridor and noticed. She noticed everything, in the way she had noticed everything since the autumn, the watchful quality of her silence having become a form of continuous attention, that the air in the corridor was different. Not the smell. Something beneath the smell. A displacement, as if the corridor contained slightly less than it had the day before and the air had not yet adjusted to the reduction. She walked through it at her usual pace. She did not slow down. She went out into the lane, which was cold and grey and indifferent, and began the walk to Leather Lane. In the weeks that followed, the building continued. This is the word that applies, not recovered, not adapted, not grieved. Continued. The rent was due in June and people were already calculating, in the quiet ongoing way that the approach of a rent quarter produces, what they would have and what they would need and how the distance between the two might be managed. The chandler called for William twice in April and once in May. Each time, William went. Each time, he returned with what he had earned and placed it on the table. His cough had changed, not worse, precisely, but different in character, deeper, as if it had moved from the surface to somewhere further in and was now reporting from a greater distance. The well in the courtyard remained open. Farr's report had recommended immediate closure. The recommendation had been received. Ellen continued to boil the water. Not everyone in the building did. If you have stayed this long, through the corridor and the ceiling and the well and the children in the dark and whatever happened in the last week of March, then you understand something about this place that the official record cannot quite hold. Leaving alike is the quietest way to say you were here. The archive keeps count. The room from which the body had been removed was re-let within the fortnight. The new tenant arrived on a Thursday with a single bag and a child of perhaps 3 who held the bag's handle and did not let go of it during the process of moving in, as if the bag were the fixed point around which everything else would have to arrange itself. They moved through the corridor. They climbed the stairs. The door of the room closed behind them. The building accepted them the way it accepted everything. Without comment. Without adjustment. The creak in the attic floor came that night, as it always did, at no predictable hour, for no identifiable reason. The new tenant heard it and lay still. By the second night, they had stopped hearing it. That was how the building worked. That was how it had always worked. No one claimed it. This was the first thing, the foundational fact around which everything else about the attic space organized itself. In a building where every other room had a name attached to it, however incomplete, however approximate, the Marsh family, Agnes Fowler, and her sons, M. Dalton, the woman from the laundry, Patrick from the third floor. The attic space had none. It appeared in Sutton's rent book as unlet, which was the category reserved for rooms generating no income, a category that in practice meant either vacant or occupied by someone whose arrangement with the building existed outside the formal structure of tenancy. Unlet. The word did not mean empty. It meant unclaimed, which was a different thing entirely. The stairs to the attic were narrower than the others. This has already been established. Farr noted it during his inspection, the treads worn in a pattern suggesting regular use. What Farr did not note, because the form did not ask and he did not think to add it to the general observations section, which was already fuller than any he had previously written, was the direction of the wear. The center of each tread, where the wear was deepest, was not centered. It was offset, slightly to the left on the ascending side, slightly to the right on the descending, consistent with someone of a particular height and a particular gait using the stairs repeatedly over an extended period. The offset suggested someone small. A child, possibly. Or a small adult. Or simply someone who had learned, through repetition, to navigate the stairs in the particular way that this staircase, with its slight lean to the left and its third tread that was marginally higher than the others, rewarded. The blanket Farr had found, folded against the higher wall, was gone by the time of a second visit, a follow-up inspection conducted in June by a different inspector, a man named Oakes who was less thorough than Farr and whose report on number 26 ran to 1 page where Farr's had run to 3. Oakes noted the attic space as vacant. He noted the skylight, present, intact. He noted the marks on the lower wall and recorded them as damage, consistent with previous tenancy, without further elaboration. He did not count them. The tin cup was gone. The candle stub was gone. The stone that had served as a holder remained, positioned against the wall below the marks, too heavy or too unremarkable to have been taken. The marks themselves were the thing that remained. 112 of them, by Farr's count, groups of 5, the 5th drawn through the 4 preceding, in the particular counting system that requires no instruction, that appears independently in isolated conditions across centuries and continents, as if the human need to mark time against a wall is not a cultural habit but something more fundamental. The marks began approximately 2 feet from the corner, at a height consistent with someone sitting rather than standing, roughly 18 inches from the floor, the kind of height a person's hand reaches naturally when they are seated against a wall with their knees drawn up. They progressed along the wall in a line that was almost straight, drifting slightly downward over the course of the first 40 or 50 marks before leveling out, as if the person making them had found, through practice, the height that required the least effort to maintain consistently. 112 days. 16 weeks. Beginning, if Farr's inspection in March is taken as the approximate endpoint, sometime in late November of 1848. Late November, when the cold had settled into the building for the winter, when the daylight through the skylight had reduced to a few hours of grey at the centre of the day, when the attic, with no fireplace and no insulation beyond the roof tiles above and the accumulated warmth of the floors below, would have been as cold at night as anything short of the street itself. 16 weeks in that space. Marking each day. Folding the blanket in the morning with sufficient care that it read, to Farr's eye, as an act of habit rather than an act of concealment. Who had been there, whether it was one person or more than one, whether it was a child or an adult or some combination that the single set of wear marks on the stairs could not fully account for, whether they had come from outside the building or had been inside the building all along and had simply moved upward, above the reach of Sutton's rent book and the parish inspector's form, is not established by any document that survives. The residents of the building, when Farr and later Oakes asked, produced the same category of response they had produced for every question about the attic space. Minimum information. Consistent direction. Not denial. Something more careful than denial, answers shaped to neither confirm nor expose, to satisfy the question's formal requirements without feeding whatever might follow from a fuller answer. Clara Marsh had been up those stairs. This is not documented. There is no record that places her in the attic space, no account that names her in connection with it. But the wear on the left side of the ascending tread was consistent with someone of her height, and the manufactory closed on Sundays, and Clara had developed, sometime in the months since she had stopped speaking, the habit of disappearing from the room on Sunday afternoons for periods of 1 to 2 hours, returning without explanation and without the particular quality of having been outside that cold air and street noise produce. She returned instead with the quality of someone who had been in a contained space, a stillness about her, a settledness, as if she had found somewhere that the room's 14 feet by 11 did not reach. Whether she had found whoever was up there, or whether she had simply found the space itself and whatever it contained, the blanket, the cup, the marks on the wall, and had sat in it alone, taking from it whatever it offered, is not possible to determine. She did not say. She had not said much of anything for months. But on the Sunday afternoons when she returned from wherever she had been, she sat at the table rather than near the window, and she looked at her family with an expression that her mother described, years later, in the account she gave to the journalist, as the expression of someone who has just remembered something important and has not yet decided whether to share it. She never shared it. In June, when Oakes made his follow-up visit and found the attic vacant and the blanket gone, Clara was at the manufactory. She was there 6 days a week now. They had increased her hours in April, which meant more money and also meant that Sunday was the only day that belonged to anything other than the wire frames and the paper petals and the dye that did not wash out. On the Sunday after Oakes's visit, she went up the stairs as she sometimes did. The space was empty in a way it had not been before. The stone was still there, below the marks on the wall. She sat against the wall for a while, in the place where the blanket had been. Above her, through the skylight, the June sky was the particular pale grey of London in summer, not threatening, not quite clear, the kind of sky that commits to nothing. She looked at the marks. 112 of them. She did not add to them. After a while she went back down the stairs, stepping slightly to the left on each tread, the way the staircase rewarded, the way she had always done it. The attic held its empty above the rest of the building. The stone remained where it had been left. The marks did not change. Whatever the count had been for, it was finished. The Hendersons had a plan. This distinguished them from most of the other residents of number 26 in a way that was difficult to quantify but easy to sense, a quality of forward orientation, of existing in the present tense while simultaneously inhabiting a version of the near future that they had constructed with some care and were maintaining with considerable effort. Robert Henderson worked as a compositor at a printing house on Fleet Street. It was skilled work, the kind of work that had a guild behind it, a structure of wages that was at least partially resistant to the downward pressure that unskilled labor experienced without recourse. He earned more than Thomas Marsh, more than Patrick's father, more than most of the men in the building. Not enough to leave immediately. Enough, if managed with sufficient precision over a sufficient period, to leave eventually. Eventually was the word the plan turned on. Eventually, precisely defined, was 18 months from the autumn of 1848. His wife, Jane, kept the accounts. This was not a figure of speech. She kept an actual account, recorded in a small notebook with a blue cover that she had purchased specifically for the purpose. in which she entered every expenditure and every receipt in columns that balanced to within a penny each week. The notebook was kept in the lining of the family's traveling bag, a large canvas bag, reinforced at the corners, purchased second-hand from a man on Clerkenwell Road who had acquired it from the estate of a commercial traveller. The bag represented the plan in physical form. It was large enough to hold everything the Henderson family owned that was worth taking. It had been packed, partially, since the spring, the items they would not need until they left already folded inside it, the items required for daily life arranged on top, accessible without disturbing the layers beneath. They had 2 children, a boy of 7 named George and a girl of 4 named Harriet, who had been born in the room at number 26 and who therefore had no memory of any other place, a fact that Jane Henderson thought about with a particular frequency that she did not discuss with Robert because the plan required a quality of focus that she understood could be disrupted by certain kinds of thinking. She thought about it anyway. Late at night, after the children were asleep and Robert was reading by the last of the lamp, she lay in the dark and thought about Harriet having no memory of any other place and what that meant for what Harriet understood to be normal, and what Harriet would carry forward from this room into whatever room came after, invisibly, in the way that earliest environments are carried, not as memory but as expectation, as the baseline against which everything subsequent is measured. The plan was for Islington. Specifically, for a street in Islington that Robert's colleague at the printing house had described as quiet and respectable, where rooms could be had for a rent that was higher than Field Lane but not impossibly so, and where the quality of the air and the distance from the river and the absence of the particular density of accumulated difficulty that Field Lane concentrated into every cubic foot of its atmosphere would constitute, for the Henderson family, something approaching a different life. Robert had walked to Islington on a Sunday in September to look at the street. He had stood on it for a few minutes. He had looked at the houses, which were terraced and modest but intact, their windows clean, their steps swept. He had come back and told Jane that it was as his colleague had described. Jane had written Islington confirmed in the blue notebook, in the margin beside the savings total for that week, and underlined it. In November of 1848, the savings total in the blue notebook stood at £3.14. The target was £6, enough for the advance rent and the removal and a month's buffer against the transition. At the rate they were saving, with no unexpected expenditures, 18 months was achievable. Achievable was the word Robert used. Jane used the word possible, which was a different word in a way that Robert understood and did not contest. The winter was the first disruption. George developed a fever in December that kept him from school for 3 weeks and required a doctor's visit. One visit, carefully considered and delayed until delay was no longer reasonable, costing 2 shillings that came directly from the savings total in the blue notebook. Jane recorded the expenditure in the debit column with the same precision she recorded everything else. She did not write anything in the margin beside it. The total adjusted. The timeline extended by approximately 3 weeks. The second disruption came in February, when the printing house reduced its compositors' hours in response to a slowdown in commissions that Robert's senior colleagues said was temporary and that Robert, who had been a compositor long enough to have seen several temporary slowdowns, suspected was less temporary than described. His weekly earnings fell by a third for 6 weeks. Jane adjusted the notebook. The timeline extended. She did not change the word Islington confirmed in the margin. She did not underline it again. It remained where she had written it, in September, when the street had been real and the plan had been a matter of arithmetic rather than endurance. By the summer of 1849, the savings total stood at £3.02, less than it had been in November, the winter having consumed not just the buffer against disruption but a portion of what had been accumulated before it. The timeline, recalculated, had extended to something that the word eventually was beginning to cover less precisely than it had. Robert recalculated it on a Sunday evening in July, at the table, with the blue notebook open in front of him. He was careful with his arithmetic. He checked it twice. He closed the notebook and put it back in the bag and did not tell Jane the new figure, because Jane had done the same arithmetic herself 3 days earlier and they had, without discussing it, arrived at the same understanding, which was that the plan was intact but that intact was doing more work than it had been designed to do. The bag stood in the corner of the room, partially packed, as it had been since spring. The items that would not be needed until they left, folded inside. The blue notebook in the lining. Harriet, who was now 5, had developed the habit of touching the bag's handle when she passed it, not holding it, not attempting to move it, just touching it in the brief way a child touches something that has been present for as long as they can remember and has become, through sheer duration, a fixed point. She did not know what it was for. She knew it was important. The way children know things that have not been explained to them, through the quality of the attention the adults around them bring to an object, through the particular care with which it is maintained and never moved and never discussed in the casual way that unimportant things are discussed. Robert returned to full hours in September. The notebook adjusted upward. The timeline contracted. The plan resumed its forward motion, slower than it had been, but forward. Jane wrote nothing new in the margin. The word Islington remained confirmed. The underline held. In the corridor below, the door beside the staircase remained closed. The building continued its patient collection of people and their plans and their notebooks and their bags packed against a future that kept receding at approximately the rate they advanced toward it. It had held plans like this before. It would hold them again. The bag stood in the corner. Harriet touched its handle on her way past. The handle was worn smooth where she always touched it. The plan continued. The room continued around it. It was not the smell of the building. This was the first thing anyone who noticed it said, that it was distinct, separate, underneath the ambient smell that Field Lane produced and that everyone who lived there had long since stopped registering. That smell was known. This was something else. Something that arrived and departed on no schedule that anyone could determine, that was present on some mornings and absent for days at a time, that moved through the lower floor of the building in a way that did not correspond to the direction of the wind outside or the opening and closing of doors or any other variable that the residents, who were observant people in the way that people become observant when their environment requires it, could identify as a cause. It came from below. This was agreed upon without discussion, agreed in the way that things are agreed upon in shared spaces when the agreement is obvious enough that stating it would constitute a kind of insult to the collective intelligence of the people involved. Below the ground floor. Below the stone flags of the corridor. From whatever existed underneath number 26 that the building's plan, incomplete, unreliable, bearing its usual passing relationship to the structure it was supposed to describe, did not account for. London in 1849 was riddled with what lay beneath it. Cellars, vaults, the remnants of older structures absorbed by newer ones, passages that had connected buildings now demolished, the infrastructure of a city that had been building over itself for centuries without always troubling to remove what it was building over. In Holborn specifically, an area of the city with a particularly layered history, where the ground had been worked and reworked and worked again, what lay below a given building was frequently not known precisely by anyone currently living, and was known imprecisely by the buildings themselves only in the structural ways that matter: the way a floor settles, the way damp moves, the way sound travels upward from enclosed spaces through stone and timber with a fidelity that the material world generally reserves for things it considers important. The woman from the laundry noticed it first, or was the first to mention it, which is not the same thing but is the only version the record preserves. She described it to a neighbor on the stairs in October of 1849 as organic. She used that word, organic, which was a precise word for someone in her position to use, and which suggested either particular acuity of sensory discrimination or exposure, at some point in her life, to a context in which such words were in circulation. Organic, meaning living, or having been living. Meaning something biological rather than mineral, something that had at some point been part of a process that was no longer operating but had not yet fully concluded. Agnes Fowler's eldest son went down to the corridor floor with a candle on a Sunday morning in November and examined the flags. He was looking for a gap, a separation between stones, a place where something below might communicate with something above. He found the flags continuous, mortared, presenting no obvious aperture. He found, in the corner nearest the door that did not open, a section of mortar that was softer than the rest, not crumbling, not absent, but yielding slightly under pressure in a way that new mortar does not and old mortar does only when it has been in sustained contact with moisture from below. He noted this. He stood up. He did not mention it to anyone except his mother, who received the information with the expression she had developed over years of receiving information about the building that she could do nothing about. The smell continued through November and into December, present on perhaps one morning in 3, lasting an hour or two and then receding, not disappearing entirely, but retreating to a level below conscious perception, below the threshold where the nose reports to the mind that something requires attention. It was worst after rain, when the water table rose and whatever lay below the building adjusted to the pressure from above. It was absent in dry cold, when the ground contracted and held what it contained more tightly. No one opened the door in the corridor. This observation, which had been available since the building's first appearance in this account, acquired, by December of 1849, a quality it had not previously possessed. Not quite urgency. Something more patient than urgency, and more troubling. The smell came from below. The door beside the staircase opened onto something. A space below the ground floor level, presumably. A space that the building's plan did not describe and that no resident had entered and that had been closed long enough for the wood to settle permanently into the frame. These two facts had always existed independently. By December they had begun to feel less independent. The smell arrived on the morning of the 19th. It was stronger than it had been before, noticeably, unambiguously stronger, present at the top of the stairs as well as the bottom, reaching the first landing for the first time. Thomas Marsh smelled it when he descended at 5 in the morning. He stopped on the third step, the one that groaned, and stood there for a moment in the dark. Then he continued down. He passed the door. He went out into the lane. By the time he returned that evening, the smell had receded. The door was as it had always been. Closed. Settled. Not intending to be otherwise. The walls sweated. This was not a metaphor. In January of 1851, following 3 weeks of cold so sustained and so complete that the courtyard well froze to a depth that made drawing water impossible for 4 days, a thaw arrived, not gradual, not the slow moderation that cold usually concedes to, but sudden, the temperature rising 12 degrees in less than 24 hours, The kind of meteorological shift that the city's older residents described as the weather losing patience with itself. When it came, the walls of number 26 produced moisture. Not at the surfaces only, not the familiar condensation that cold walls generate when warm breath meets them. From within. The plaster darkening in expanding patches, the moisture appearing at the junction of wall and ceiling first, then spreading downward, following the internal architecture of the building the way water always follows what it knows. In the marsh room, the patch appeared above the window, the north-facing window, the one with the oilcloth over the cracked lower pane, the window that Clara had sat beside for 2 years before the manufactory hours had taken that time from her. The patch was dark against the already darkened plaster, roughly circular, approximately the size of a dinner plate, the same description Agnes Fowler had used for the stain on her ceiling 7 years earlier, the same geometry that damp and enclosed spaces tends toward when it first makes itself visible, as if water, given sufficient time and sufficient wall, always arrives at the same form. Ellen looked at it. She said nothing. She had been in the room long enough to understand that saying something about the walls to anyone with the authority to act on it produced a category of response she had already experienced, and that the wall would continue regardless. William was 15 now. He had not gone to the Chandlers since October. The shop had taken on a boy who lived closer and who could therefore be called at shorter notice, which was the operational requirement the Chandler actually needed met, and William's slightly longer walk had become, in the arithmetic of the Chandler's convenience, a liability. He had found other work, intermittently, carrying, sweeping, the kind of labor that presents itself in the mornings near Smithfield and Farringdon if you arrive early enough and are willing to take what is offered without negotiation. His cough had become, over the 2 years since Farr had noted it and recommended assessment, something that the family had integrated so completely into the texture of daily life that it functioned less as a symptom than as a kind of presence, a regular sound that the room produced, like the creak of the third stair or the particular rattle of the window frame when the wind came from the north. Clara was 16. She had been at the manufactory for 3 years. Her hands were permanently marked by the dye, not the faint blue-green cast of her first year, but something deeper now, worked into the skin at the fingertips and the creases of the knuckles in a way that washing no longer reached. She had begun to speak more in the past year, not the continuous commentary of childhood, nothing like that, but a deliberate and considered speech, deployed with the precision of someone who has spent a long time deciding which words are worth the expenditure. She spoke to William more than to anyone else. In the evenings, when the room had settled into its night configuration and their parents were asleep, they talked in the low voice the room required, not about the manufactory or the carrying work or the rent, but about other things, things that existed at a slight angle to the daily necessities, things that the room in its daytime mode did not easily accommodate. The twins were 8. James had started at a blacking factory on the Strand in September, following a path that the neighborhood generated with a consistency that felt, to anyone paying attention, less like coincidence than like design. The other twin, still unnamed in the records, still referred to in the parish documents only in relation to James, had developed a limp in the summer, the origin of which was not documented, that had resolved partially by winter and remained partially, a slight favoring of the left leg that was visible on the stairs and invisible on flat ground, which meant that most people in the building did not know it was there. The building that winter held itself together with the particular effort of structures that have been holding themselves together for a long time without adequate assistance. The wall in Agnes Fowler's room had been repaired again, a third time, the boards replaced with actual plaster on this occasion, applied by a man Sutton had arranged for after Agnes had refused, quietly and without drama, to pay the December quarter until something was done. The plaster was adequate. It covered the damage. Whether it addressed what was causing the damage, the moisture in the timber above, the slow infiltration that the roof had been permitting for years, was a different question, one that the plaster's surface did not answer and that no one with authority over the roof had been asked to address. The sweating walls dried over the course of a week as the temperature stabilized. The patches remained, darker than the surrounding plaster, preserved in the wall the way the winter preserved everything it touched, as evidence. The patch above the marsh window remained visible through February and into March, shrinking slightly at the edges as the surface dried but holding its center, a dark circle above the oilcloth, above the cracked pane, permanent in the way that things become permanent when no one has the means to remove them. William looked at it sometimes, in the evenings. Clara noticed him looking. She did not say anything. There were things in the room that were better held in the way they had always been held, quietly, between people who understood each other well enough that the silence between them carried more than the words would have. Outside, the lane was cold and still. The walls held their moisture in the dark. Aldous Pembridge arrived on a Thursday in April of 1852. He came with a man in a better suit than his own, a solicitor, or someone performing the function of a solicitor, carrying a leather case and a measuring instrument and the particular expression of a professional who has been engaged to assess something and intends to assess it without being drawn into conversation about what the assessment means. They arrived at 10:30. Sutton was with them, Sutton, who had been collecting rent at number 26 for 14 years and who walked through the front door with the ease of long familiarity and the careful neutrality of a man who understands that his position requires him to be useful to the person paying him without being visibly aligned against the people he collects from. Pembridge was 61. He was a larger man than the building seemed to expect, not fat, but substantial, occupying space in the corridor in a way that made the corridor's narrowness apparent in a new way, as if the building were being measured against him rather than the other way around. He stood at the entrance for a moment and looked down the corridor toward the staircase. He looked at the door beside the staircase. He did not try the handle. He looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds and then turned to the man with the measuring instrument and said something that Sutton, who was standing close enough to hear, did not record and did not repeat. They went through the building systematically, but they did not knock on doors. They measured the corridor. They measured the staircase width. They stood in the doorway of the ground floor room. The tenant was out, the door unlocked, and the man with the instrument measured its dimensions while Pembridge looked at the ceiling and the window and the floor with the expression of someone performing an inventory of an asset rather than an inspection of a home. He did not touch anything. He did not speak to the building's contents, the objects that accumulated in rooms where people live, that absorb the texture of the lives around them. He looked at the shell. The shell was what he owned. On the first floor landing they encountered Ellen Marsh, who was descending the stairs with a water vessel. She stopped. Pembridge looked at her. He said good morning. She said good morning. He stepped to the side to allow her to pass and she descended and went through the corridor and out to the courtyard and drew her water and came back and climbed the stairs again. And by the time she reached the landing, Pembridge and the man with the instrument had moved to the second floor and the landing was empty. They spent 11 minutes on the upper floors combined. They went to the attic. The door was open, as it had been since the occupant or occupants had departed, as Oakes had found it in June of 1849. The man measured it. Pembridge stood in the center of the space, under the skylight, and looked at the marks on the lower wall. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at the skylight. Then he said something to the man with the instrument who wrote something in a small notebook he had produced from the leather case. They were in the building for 40 minutes in total. When they left, Sutton held the front door and then followed them out and pulled it closed behind him. The lane received them. Pembridge and the man with the instrument walked toward Holborn without looking back. Sutton stood outside the door for a moment, looking at the building's facade, the brickwork, the windows, the particular quality of a structure that has been used hard and maintained minimally for a long time. Then he walked in the other direction. Inside, the building was quiet. Ellen Marsh set down her water vessel and looked at the wall above the window, the patch, still there, darker at the center. No one had asked her anything. No one had explained the visit. No one had said what the measurements were for. The building did not explain either. It had never needed to. The parish register for St Andrew Holborn shows 2 baptisms in the 3rd week of September, 1852. Both list Field Lane as the address. Both were conducted on the same day, a Saturday, which was not unusual, baptisms being frequently grouped for administrative convenience. The names recorded are common ones, the kind that appear throughout the register with sufficient frequency to make individual identification difficult. 2 children, born within the same week, baptized on the same Saturday. This was the kind of thing that happened in buildings like number 26, life arriving in clusters, as if the proximity of people in confined spaces produced a kind of synchrony that extended even to the timing of births. The same register, for the same week, shows 2 burials. Also from Field Lane. Also recorded with the compression that elevated mortality produces in parish clerks managing a register that is filling faster than it was designed to. The causes given are brief, fever, and in the second case, simply decline, which was the period's administrative shorthand for a process that had been ongoing long enough that the specific mechanism had become secondary to the fact of its conclusion. For entries in 1 week. 2 arrivals, 2 departures. The register does not distinguish between rooms or floors. Field Lane is the address. The building contains the entries the way it contained everything, without comment, without visible adjustment, absorbing the week's arithmetic into its structure and continuing. What happened in the corridor on the night of the 18th of September is not in any register. It is in the account of a woman named Sarah Oby, one of the building's newer residents, arrived in the spring of that year with her husband and 2 children, occupying the room on the ground floor opposite the corridor door. She gave her account to a church visitor in 1867, 15 years later, in response to a question about her time on Field Lane that she had clearly been waiting, for some years, for someone to ask. She said, "There was a night in September when the corridor was not empty." She said this carefully. She had been awake, one of the children was feverish, the fever that was also in the register that week, the fever that resolved, and she had heard, through the wall between her room and the corridor, movement. Not footsteps, exactly. Something more deliberate than footsteps. Something that began near the front door and moved toward the staircase and stopped. And then, after a period she estimated as several minutes but could not confirm, a period in which the building produced none of its usual sounds, as if it too were listening, a sound from the direction of the door beside the staircase that she described, after a long pause, as a settling. Like something that had been held for a long time, she said, being put down. She did not open her door. Her husband was asleep. The child's fever broke before morning. She did not mention the corridor to anyone in the building in the days that followed, not because she doubted what she had heard, but because she understood, by September of 1852, that the corridor was a subject the building held in a particular way, and that adding her account to it would not change what the corridor was or what it contained. The door was closed in the morning, as it always was. The 2 baptisms took place on the Saturday. The register recorded them in the same ink, on the same page, as the 2 burials. The building held all 4 without distinguishing between them. The corridor was quiet. Whatever had been put down remained where it had been placed. His name was Joseph. Joseph Carey, one of the few residents of number 26 whose full name appears consistently across multiple documents, which was itself a kind of accident, the result of a ragged school attendance record that had been preserved when most such records from the period had not, and which listed him by name on 14 separate dates between January and June of 1853. He was 7 years old. He lived on the 3rd floor with his mother and an older sister whose name the attendance record does not include because she did not attend the school, her labor being required elsewhere in a way that the school's register did not track and did not ask about. Joseph drew on walls. This is documented in the only way that such things are documented when the person doing them is 7 years old and poor and invisible to most of the systems that generate documentation, through the drawings themselves, which survived, in partial form, because the wall they were drawn on survived, incorporated into a subsequent structure built on the same footprint after the demolition of 1864, and discovered during renovation work in 1971 when a section of later plaster was removed and the original surface beneath it was exposed. The drawings were photographed. The photographs are held in the London Metropolitan Archives. They show the following: a horse, rendered with the particular confidence of a child who has looked at horses carefully and reproduced what they actually saw rather than what they expected to see. The legs too long, the neck correctly muscular, the eye a single deliberate mark that somehow achieves expression. Beside the horse, a building, 4 windows, a door, a roofline indicated by a single diagonal stroke. Whether the building is number 26 or some other building or no specific building at all is not possible to determine. It has the quality of a building drawn from memory rather than observation, the proportions of an idea rather than a structure. Below the building, drawn at a height consistent with a child sitting on the floor, a row of figures. 8 of them, or possibly 9, the rightmost figure partially obscured by a later layer of plaster that had not been fully removed. The figures are simple, vertical strokes for bodies, horizontal for arms, circles for heads. The kind of figures that children produce universally, across centuries, when given a surface and something to mark it with. Except that 7 of the 8 clearly visible figures are standing. And 1, the 4th from the left, approximately, is lying down. Horizontal where the others are vertical. The same simple construction, the same circle for a head, the same strokes. Just horizontal. The researcher who catalogued the photographs in 1971 noted this in her report. She noted it briefly, in a subordinate clause, before moving on to a description of the horse, which she found more artistically significant. She was probably right about the horse. The horse is extraordinary for a child of 7. But the figure lying down among the standing figures is the thing that stays, the thing that the eye returns to after the horse, after the building, after the row of simple marks that Joseph Carey made on the wall of the 3rd floor room of number 26 at some point in the first half of 1853. Joseph left the ragged school in June of that year. The attendance record simply stops. No explanation, no note, the kind of ending that records of this period produce when the child's circumstances have changed in a way that the record-keeping system is not designed to follow. Whether he found work, or his family left the building, or something else occurred that summed to alter the conditions that had placed him in the school in the first instance, is not established. He does not appear in any subsequent document associated with Field Lane or the surrounding streets. The drawings remained on the wall after he left. This is the nature of drawings on walls. They outlast the person who made them, sometimes by decades, sometimes by centuries, indifferent to the passage of time in the way that marks pressed into a surface are indifferent, having achieved a kind of permanence that was not necessarily intended but that the material world conferred regardless. The subsequent tenants of the third-floor room lived against the drawings without, presumably, thinking about them much, the horse and the building and the row of figures becoming, through familiarity, simply part of what the wall was, the way the creak of the third stair had become simply part of what the staircase was, the way every fixed feature of the building had become invisible through duration to the people who moved through it every day. The horse looked toward the window. This is what the photographs show. The horse's head angled slightly upward and to the right, toward where the room's window would have been, in the direction of whatever light reached the third floor in the afternoons. Whether Joseph had intended this, or whether it was simply the direction the drawing faced when his hand produced it, is not something the photographs can answer. But the effect is of an animal that is looking at something outside the frame, that knows there is something beyond the wall it inhabits and is attending to it, patiently, in the way that animals in confined spaces sometimes attend to what they cannot reach. The figure lying down does not look anywhere. It is simply horizontal. Among the vertical ones. On a wall on the third floor of a building that would stand for another 11 years before the demolition came. Joseph Carey made 14 marks in the attendance register. He made considerably more on the wall. The register is gone. The wall, in part, is not. Of the two records he left behind, the one that was never intended as a record is the one that survived. The difference between leaving and being removed was not always clear in the documents. This was partly a function of language. The period's administrative vocabulary for the displacement of poor families from condemned or sold properties tended toward euphemism, toward words like vacated and cleared and relocated that described outcomes without specifying the degree of agency involved in producing them. And it was partly a function of the reality those words were describing, in which the line between a family deciding to go and a family understanding that going was the only remaining option had become so thin as to be, in practical terms, the same line. You left because there was nothing left to stay for. You left because the notices had been posted and the deadline had passed and the men with the authority to enforce the deadline were available to do so. You left because the building was being sold, or condemned, or both, and your tenancy, which had never been robust, which had always existed in the particular legal shadow that poor tenants occupied, without lease, without recourse, without the protections that money purchased, had been terminated by a letter that Sutton had delivered in person, 1 copy per household, on a Tuesday morning in March of 1863. The Marsh family received their copy on that Tuesday. Thomas was at work. Clara received it. Clara, who was now 27, who had been at the manufactory for 15 years, whose hands were marked to the wrist by the dye that had never washed out, who had lived in the room on the first floor of number 26 for 16 years, longer than she had lived anywhere else, longer than she had lived without it. She read the letter. She set it on the table. She went to the window, the north-facing window, the oilcloth long since replaced but the crack in the lower pane still there, never repaired, simply accepted as a condition of the glass, and she looked out at the lane. William was not there to receive his copy. William had died in the February of 1858, 9 years after Farr had noted his cough and recommended assessment without delay, 7 years after the assessment had not come, in the room where he had been born, in the winter, which was when the cough always worsened and from which, in the February of 1858, it did not recover. He was 22. The cause recorded in the parish register was consumption, the word the period used for what had been using William slowly and steadily since at least the winter of 1848, fed by the water from the courtyard well and the cold of the room and the particular quality of air that 14 feet by 11 produced when 6 people breathed it for years. The twins had left earlier. James had gone to Birmingham in 1855, following the work that the printing trades were concentrating there, having crossed paths at some point with Robert Henderson's colleague and absorbed the same information about the Midlands that Henderson had absorbed years before. The other twin, still unnamed in every record that survives, which had ceased, by adulthood, to feel like an oversight and had begun to feel like a choice, though whose choice and made when and why remained unclear, had left in 1857 for reasons that the family did not discuss in any account that was subsequently recorded. He sent money occasionally. The money arrived without a return address. Thomas had retired from the tannery in 1861, his lungs having absorbed 15 years of the tannery's particular atmosphere and arrived at a condition that the tannery's work required and the tannery's work had produced and which now made the tannery's work impossible. He sat mostly. He sat in the room and looked at the patch above the window, which had dried and re-darkened through so many winters that it had become geological, a record of seasons laid down in the plaster, each year's moisture adding a ring to what the year before had left. He did not talk much. He had not talked much for years. The room had a quality, by 1863, of having been lived in so completely, for so long, by people who had brought everything they had to it and left most of themselves in it, that it had become less a space than an accumulation of breath and habit and the particular silence of people who have known each other long enough that silence is the primary language. Clara organized the leaving. This was not assigned to her, it simply fell to her, in the way that things fall to the person in a family who has the clearest relationship with the practical requirements of a situation. She found a room in Clerkenwell, smaller than the one on Field Lane, which she had not thought possible, but on a street where the air was marginally different and the well was a street pump that had been tested and certified after the Broad Street outbreak had finally impressed upon the relevant authorities that testing and certifying water sources was not an optional administrative function. The rent was manageable. She had been managing rent for a long time. They left on a Saturday in April. Thomas walked slowly. Ellen carried the things that mattered, which were fewer than they had been, the years having reduced the family's possessions through the same process of attrition that they had reduced everything else, until what remained was the minimum that daily life required plus the small number of objects that had survived because they were attached to something that could not be let go of. Clara carried the rest. At the door, she stopped. She stood in the corridor for a moment, the corridor that she had walked through twice a day for 16 years, in the dark before dawn and in the dark after dusk, that she had learned with the completeness that only repetition produces, whose smell she had stopped noticing so long ago that she could not remember noticing it. She looked toward the staircase. She looked at the door beside it, which was closed, which had always been closed, which she had never opened and had never seen opened and about which she had formed, over 16 years of daily proximity, a relationship that was not quite understanding and not quite fear and not quite acceptance but contained elements of all three in proportions that she had never tried to quantify. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went out into the lane. The door of number 26 closed behind her. The building held what it had always held. The corridor was quiet. The door beside the staircase was as it had always been. Closed. Settled. Patient. The last family left on a Wednesday in October of 1863. After that, the building was empty in the technical sense, no rent collected, no names in Sutton's book, no smoke from any chimney visible from the lane. Empty in the administrative sense. In every other sense, the word required qualification. Buildings that have been inhabited for a long time do not become empty the way a vessel becomes empty when its contents are removed. They become something else, something that has no precise name in English, though certain other languages gesture toward it more accurately. A condition of residual presence. The accumulated weight of years of habitation pressing into surfaces that recorded everything they received and released nothing voluntarily. The walls of number 26, in the winter of 1863 and into the spring of 1864, held what they had always held: the moisture, the marks, the particular quality of air that does not circulate because the windows are closed and the doors are closed and there is no longer any breathing to disturb it. A man named Greer, employed by the new owner to assess the property ahead of demolition, entered the building in February of 1864. He had been given a key, a large iron key that Sutton had surrendered with the expression of a man releasing something he had held for a long time and was not entirely certain he wanted to release. Greer was practical, experienced, not given to impressions. He had assessed condemned properties throughout Holborn and Southwark for 11 years. He entered number 26 at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday in February and worked through it floor by floor, noting the structural condition of each room, the state of the windows and floors and ceilings, the materials present, the work that demolition would require. On the ground floor he found 3 things that his report noted as requiring specific mention. The first was a coat, a woman's coat, dark wool, hanging on a hook beside the door of the room that had been Sarah Obi's. It was in reasonable condition. It had been left deliberately, hung, not dropped, on a hook that someone had used for years. Whether it had been forgotten or left behind for a reason that the coat itself could not explain was not something Greer's report addressed. He noted it. He moved on. The second was a knife, a short-bladed working knife, its handle worn smooth with use, found on the floor of the ground floor room nearest the courtyard, in the corner furthest from the door. It had not fallen, it was positioned, lying flat, in a way that suggested it had been placed there rather than dropped. Greer noted it. He noted its condition, functional, not damaged, the kind of knife that would have had daily use in a working household and that would not have been left behind accidentally. He did not speculate about why it had been left. His report was not a document for speculation. The third was a name. Carved into the plaster of the corridor wall, at a height of approximately 14 inches from the floor, low, as if made by someone sitting or crouching, or by a child. The letters were careful, deliberate, formed with something narrow and pointed, pressed deeply enough into the plaster to have survived the months since the building had been vacated. Greer copied the name into his report. The report survives. The name in it is partially illegible, the transcription uncertain at 2 of the letters, the handwriting at that point in the document slightly less precise than the rest, as if Greer had been kneeling on the corridor floor to read it and had written the transcription in that position, which was not how he usually wrote. The name, as best as it can be read, is not one that appears elsewhere in any document associated with the building. It is not Marsh, not Fowler, not Dalton, not Henderson, not Carey, not Obi. It is not Sutton or Pembridge or Farr or Callow or any of the other names that the building's administrative history generated and preserved. It is a name that exists, in the entire surviving record, only here, in the corridor of number 26, 14 inches from the floor, carved by someone who wanted it to remain after everything else had gone. Greer went upstairs. He noted the marks in the attic, still there, still 112, unchanged since Farr had counted them 15 years earlier. He noted the stone on the floor beneath them, still in its position against the wall. He noted Joseph Carey's drawings on the 3rd floor wall, the horse, the building, the row of figures, the one that was horizontal. He noted them as damage, consistent with long tenancy, no structural significance. He noted the patch above the first-floor window, now so deeply worked into the plaster that it had become the wall's permanent color in that area, a dark oval that the years had refined into something almost deliberate, almost intentional, as if the wall had been marking the window's position from above for reasons of its own. He came back down to the ground floor. He stood in the corridor. He looked at the door beside the staircase, which was closed, which his key had not opened. He had tried it, briefly, and noted, access not obtained, as Farr had noted before him. He stood there for a moment longer than his other pauses in the building. His report does not explain this pause. Reports of this kind do not record pauses. He went out into the lane. He wrote his report. The building stood through the winter and into the spring. The coat remained on its hook. The knife remained in its corner. The name remained in the plaster, 14 inches from the floor, in letters that had been made to last. The door beside the staircase remained as it had always been, closed, settled, patient, holding whatever it had always held in the dark below the building, in the space that no plan had ever described and no inspector had ever entered and no resident had ever named. The lane outside was quiet. The building was quiet in the way that buildings are quiet when the breathing has stopped. Not empty. Never entirely empty. Simply waiting for what came next. They began on a Monday morning in April of 1864. For men, a foreman named Briggs and 3 labourers whose names do not appear in any document associated with the demolition, recorded only as the crew, which was how the period's building contracts referred to the people who did the physical work of taking things apart that other people had put together. They arrived at 7. The lane was already moving, the costermongers, the early workers, the children heading toward whatever the morning required of them. The crew moved through it without particular acknowledgement and entered number 26 for the last time. The method was standard. Begin at the top and work down, strip the upper floors first, remove what can be salvaged, weaken the structure progressively until the walls can be brought down without endangering the adjacent buildings, which were not being demolished and whose owners had made this requirement explicit in correspondence that Briggs had read and understood and intended to honor. It was not complicated work. It was heavy and it was dusty and it required a tolerance for the particular atmosphere of a building being unmade, the smell of old plaster released from walls that had held it for decades, the sound of timber giving way in the specific register of wood that has been under load for a long time and remembers it. Briggs had done it many times. He knew what buildings sounded like when they came apart. He knew what they smelled like. He was not, by his own account given years later to a nephew who had asked about his work, a man given to impressions about buildings. The attic came down first. The skylight was removed intact, glass was salvageable, glass had value. The roof tiles were stripped. The timber beneath was in worse condition than the exterior had suggested, the moisture having worked through it over many years in ways that the outside of the building had not advertised. When the first section of roof timber was pulled away, it came apart in the hands, not breaking so much as separating, the fibers having lost their cohesion somewhere in the long process of absorbing more than timber is designed to absorb. The laborer who pulled it said something to the man beside him. The man beside him agreed. They continued. The marks on the attic wall were exposed when the plaster came down. 112 of them, still there, still countable, the stone that had sat beneath them for 15 years still in its position against the lower wall. The laborer who brought down that section of plaster looked at the marks for a moment. He picked up the stone. He turned it over in his hand. He set it down outside on the lane, among the salvaged materials, where it sat for the remainder of the day before someone moved it or it was absorbed into the rubble. Whether he knew what the marks were for is not recorded. Whether he had made marks like that himself, at some point, in some room, was also not recorded. These are the kinds of things that are not recorded. The third floor came down on the second day. Joseph Carey's drawings were on the eastern wall, the horse, the building, the row of figures, the one that was horizontal. The wall came down in sections. The section with the drawings came down in the afternoon. The labourer who struck it did not see the drawings before he struck. The light in the room by that point was coming from the wrong direction, the roof above having been removed and the afternoon sun falling at an angle that left the eastern wall in shadow. He struck. The plaster came away. The drawings were gone before anyone looked at the wall again. The marsh room on the first floor took an hour. The patch above the north window, the dark oval that had been accumulating since 1844, that had been there when the Marsh family arrived and had outlasted them, that had been part of the room's identity for 20 years, came away with the plaster in a single section, the moisture having finally compromised the bond between plaster and brick to the point where separation required almost no force. It came away cleanly. The brick beneath it was dark and damp and smelled of everything the wall had absorbed over 2 decades. The labourer moved on. The window frame followed. The oilcloth was still attached to the inner face of the lower pane, the crack still there, the cloth darkened at its edges by 20 years of proximity to the glass. It was not salvageable. It went into the rubble. On the third day, the ground floor. The coat was still on its hook. Briggs took it down himself. He held it for a moment. It was heavier than it looked, the wool dense with age and absorbed damp. He set it on the lane outside. By the end of the day it was gone, taken by someone, or moved with the rubble, or simply absorbed into the general dispersal of things that demolition produces. The knife in the corner of the ground floor room was found by one of the labourers and pocketed without comment. The name in the corridor plaster, 14 inches from the floor, carved to last, came away when the corridor wall came down, in a section that broke apart on impact with the lane outside, the letters scattering with the plaster into fragments too small to be read. The door beside the staircase was the last interior element to be addressed. Briggs had noted it in his preliminary assessment, noted that it did not open, that the frame had settled around it with the permanence of long closure, that whatever was behind it would need to be accessed before the floor above could be safely removed. On the morning of the 4th day, one of the labourers took a crowbar to the frame. The door opened. What was behind it was stairs, a short flight, 7 steps, descending to a cellar space below the ground floor level. The cellar was low, 5 feet of clearance, perhaps less. Stone walls, a stone floor, no window, no drain. It had been used for storage at some point. There were the remnants of shelving along one wall, the brackets still present though the boards had long since gone. The smell that came up the 7 steps when the door opened was the smell that had reached the first floor landing in December of 1849. Organic, dense, the smell of a space that had been sealed for a very long time. The labourer who had opened the door stood at the top of the 7 steps and looked down. He stood there for a moment. Then he called for Briggs. Briggs's account, given to his nephew, the same account in which he described himself as not a man given to impressions about buildings, says only that he looked, and that he made a decision, and that the decision was to proceed with the demolition and to say nothing about what he had seen to anyone outside the crew. He does not describe what he saw. He says, in the account, that some things are better left in the buildings that held them. That when a building comes down, what it held comes down with it, and that this is perhaps the correct outcome, that the rubble takes everything and the new thing built on the same ground begins without it. Whether the crew agreed is not recorded. Whether they had a choice in agreeing is also not recorded. The demolition was completed by the end of the week. The rubble was cleared. The ground was leveled. A new structure rose on the same footprint within the year, different in every external particular, the same in the one that mattered, which was the ground beneath it, which was the same ground, which had received everything the previous building had produced over the course of its existence and which held it now in the way that ground holds what it receives, without record, without index, without any of the administrative apparatus that the world above it uses to account for what it cannot bring itself to lose. Field Lane was widened in 1867 as part of the Holborn Valley improvements. The name disappeared from maps shortly after. The area was absorbed into the expanding geometry of a city that was, by then, in the process of building over itself again, as it always had, as it always would, adding new layers to old ones, incorporating what came before into the foundations of what came after, carrying forward in the ground what it could not carry in memory. The archive closes here. Not because the story ends. Stories like this one do not end. They simply reach the point where the documents stop and the ground begins, where what can be known gives way to what can only be understood by standing on the surface above it and considering what it might contain. The archive closes here because this is where the record stops. Because Briggs did not say what he saw. Because the name in the plaster broke apart on the lane. Because the door that no one opened for 20 years opened once, at the end, for a man who chose not to describe what he found. The people of number 26 Field Lane lived the lives they lived. They drew water from a contaminated well because no one told them not to. They slept in rooms too small for the number of people in them because there was nowhere else. They paid rent to men who never came, and submitted reports to systems that filed them, and sent letters that received no reply, and continued, that word, always that word, continued, because continuing was the only direction available to them, and they were, without exception, people of considerable resource applied to conditions that should never have required such resource. They deserved better than Field Lane gave them. The record says so, in every document that survives, in the space between what the documents say and what they could not bring themselves to say directly. In Callow's report, filed and forgotten. In Farr's general observations, continued on the reverse. In Agnes Fowler's letter, sent and unanswered. In the blue notebook with the word Islington underlined. In the attendance register that ends without explanation. In the marks on the attic wall, counted to 112 and then stopped. The archive noticed. If this story has stayed with you, if the corridor and the well and the children in the dark before dawn and the door that finally opened have stayed with you, then you understand something about what it means to be witnessed. To have someone look at the record and refuse to look away. A like, a share, a word to someone who hasn't heard of Field Lane, these are the smallest possible acts of witness. The archive asks for them anyway. Because the people of number 26 deserved to be counted. And counting is where it begins.